Let's think about humble things today. Hey, welcome. We're taking another look into the life and message of Elizabeth Elliot. She called us to live to a higher standard each day and not be satisfied with just a little empty religion in life as a shallow substitute for giving God our best. Our series continues as we hear from family, friends, and others, all influenced by the life and message of Elizabeth Elliot. Hey, thank you for joining us today. As usual, we have two Gateway to Joy programs today as we begin a series, an 8-part series called Humble Things. And part 1, A Missionary's First Year, and Making a Home. We'll be hearing from a couple of the family members of Elizabeth Elliot as they talk about the legacy of the 5 martyrs in Operation Alka. Also, we'll be hearing from a listener who says that Elizabeth was a spiritual mentor. She did meet her one time in unexpected surroundings, and she was inspired to not waste her widowhood. We'll have that coming up later. First, though, A Missionary's First Year. Elizabeth, who served in Ecuador as a missionary, said that a mother is a missionary every day in her home. She believed in missionary service that was defined by faithfulness in our current calling, rather than a geographic location.
This is your friend, Elizabeth Elliot, talking with you today about a missionary's first year. We might call this one Great Expectations. The missionary, as you might guess, was I. In the forest that lies deep between the Andes, the western Cordillera of the Andes, and the Pacific Ocean in Ecuador, lives a tribe of Indians called the Colorados. I spent less than a year with the Colorado Indians. I was just another one of the many invaders of various kinds that go into Indian tribes. There are always the missionaries, the priests, the merchants, and, of course, the army of tourists, which I understand has increased enormously now. It does sort of unsettle me a little bit to realize that the trip that used to take me about 10 or 12 hours by banana truck and then 4 or 6 hours by horseback can now be done in a taxi. That's really hard to believe, but they tell me that you can get from Quito to Santo Domingo de los Colorados in just a couple of hours by taxi, so they must have improved the road tremendously. But back in 1952, when I was a brand new missionary, I learned that there were 2 English women missionaries working with these Colorado Indians. And they had been trying to learn the language, but they hadn't had a great deal of success, not having had the kind of linguistic training that it takes to crack an unwritten language. Nobody had ever written the Colorado language down. And so when they found out that I was in the country and was trained in this line, they invited me to come. And that's what I did. I went down there and spent almost a year. And I kept some diaries and some letters. And over the years, occasionally I've been asked to tell the story. So I've raked over the treasures, looking through the diary notes and the letters, and they're all mildewed and bespattered with squashed insects that fell from the gasoline pressure lamp that I used to use as I was writing. And it's always been very difficult to fit anything into the allotted time or to interpret it to the youth group or to the ladies who want my story for their missionary tea. So I finally decided to put it all into a book. And that book is called These Strange Ashes. It's a book that deals with the subject of loss, primarily. But I went to that area with great expectations, as any missionary would do in her first year. Carlyle wrote, "The whole past is a possession of the present. The past had always something true and is a precious possession. In a different time, in a different place, it is always some other side of our common human nature that has been developing itself. The actual true is the sum of all these, not any one of them by itself. It is better to know them all than to misknow them." So I went down to live in a little clearing in the jungle west of the Andes. We could sort of feel those Andes up there looming in the sun about 20,000 feet above us. It wasn't anything more than a feeling. You couldn't see them where we lived. But there was also the feeling of the vast Pacific lying endless to the west. We couldn't see that one either. We were shut in entirely by jungle. There was mud, wetness, warmth, mist that closed us round in the small clearing, giant trees on all sides hung with a great thick tangle of living things. There was the dirty white ox. I always remember that dirty white ox that stood always in the middle of the little clearing in the tall grass, munching away peacefully. And the apricot moon and the tree frogs and the creaking old house that we lived in. These were all the backdrop to my first year of missionary work. It was there that I was introduced rather precipitously to the serious business of people being born and people dying. I had never seen a baby born before. I had never actually been on the spot when a person died. And so these were all experiences that were packed into that first year. Experiences of joy and depression, severe tests of living with a great variety of alien humanity, aliens including my missionary colleagues from Texas and England. They were white people, of course, and then there were the white Colombians and Ecuadorians who spoke Spanish, and there were those elusive Indians that kept a discreet distance. Well, I'll have to tell you about our journey getting down there, so different from the one you'll make if you go to visit the Colorados. It was back in September of 1952 that my friend Dorothy Jones from Texas, and I were to ride in the little pickup truck that belonged to a missionary that I will call E.T., down into Santo Domingo. E.T. and his family lived in Santo Domingo, and he and his wife had offered to take us with them from Quito. Well, we learned that we were to make the first chain. What in the world does the first chain mean? I had no idea, but Dee explained to us that the little winding cobblestone road that snaked its way up from the jungle into the Andes was a one-way street. So they had to put a chain across one end, and they would stop all the traffic at one end and radio through to the people at the other end who had the chain closed, and they would say, keep the chain closed until 14 trucks come up. Supposedly they had counted the trucks, and when the 14th truck arrived, then they would open the chain and let the traffic through in the other direction. E.T. said, we'll make the 9 o'clock chain. Well, I didn't know E.T. very well at that point, but I learned over a period of the next few months that when E.T. said 9 o'clock, E.T. was very likely to mean 12 o'clock or something like that. And so he picked us up. Sure enough, we discovered that there wasn't a seat for us in the truck except on the tailgate. He had the whole back of the truck full of cargo. He and his wife filled up the front of the truck. And so Dorothy and I sat on the back tailgate and dangled our legs as we wound up higher and higher to about 13,000 feet. This was an adventure. This was a thrill. We were actually on our way to the jungle. And I felt as though I was going to be beginning the work of the Lord, my missionary work. In the years since, I've learned that all of life here is a preparation for life in heaven. Or we could say that all of life here is the Lord's work. There is no such thing as preparation. We're in it now. Because everything we do is meant to be an offering to the Lord. And everything that we do constitutes a part of His will, if we're seeking to do His will. But it was an adventure. We were headed for frontiers, thrills, dreams come true, and there were certain fears as well. But I was comforted by the promise in Isaiah 50, verse 7. The Lord God will help me, therefore shall I not be confounded. Therefore have I set my face like a flint, and I know that I shall not be ashamed. We wound up through velvet meadows with sheep in them, farmhouses, brooks, rivers, up around the shoulders of a mountain called Pichincha, from which we could see the beautiful snow-caps Cayambe Antisana and Cotopaxi glistening in the sunshine. We came to a little shack up on what's called the Paramo, the high, misty grass country of the Andes. There was a little shack there where they were selling delicious corn on the cob, boiled potatoes, and boiled eggs. We stopped. That was where the chain was, and we had to wait for the trucks to come through. We had some corn and potatoes and eggs, and I think E.T. drank a couple of Cokes, which were also available there, and there was a crowd of people standing, waiting and counting the trucks. Well, when the 14th truck had come through, they opened the chain and said, okay, now the traffic goes down to Santo Domingo, since presumably all the traffic had come up. So we started down, but we discovered that the man at the other end had miscounted, and so every now and then we would come bumper to bumper, face on with another truck, and there would be arguments and oratory, which the Latins love, and finally somebody would pull off into one of the rare places for pulling off, which sometimes meant backing up a very long way, so that the other truck could go through. The scenery was beautiful, from alpine down to tropical. Suddenly we came around a bend, and there were tropical trees draped with stringy masses of vines. We could look down into deep canyons of grotesqueness, wetness, and the sunshine of the high Andes was giving way to increasing gloom. And as the gloom of the weather increased, and we went into clouds, and sometimes even utter darkness, my gloom began to increase too. It didn't quite seem so thrilling as I had hoped it was going to be. But I still had great expectations. This was the will of God. Have you had the experience that when you get very excited about something and then you begin to move into the hard reality, some of the excitement begins to wear off?
She thought that missionary work in a place where Christ has never been named is sometimes less arduous than in places where, though he has been named, he is no longer heard. Humble Things, Part 1, A Missionary's First Year. Family members Jim and Andrea Hawthorne, Jim being the nephew of Jim Elliot, Andrea being the niece of Elizabeth. Well, they talked about the legacy of the 5 martyrs, those killed in Operation Alka: Jim Elliot, Nate Saint, Ed McCauley, Peter Fleming, and Roger Udarian gave their lives in this missionary effort.
I do find it really fascinating that in just the last couple years, there is a resurgence of interest in the story and in the lives of the 5 men and in Aunt Betty, and I think that's really telling to the power of that story, and people relate to story, and so I believe that story speaks to people of obedience and forgiveness and grace and so many things that the world doesn't have these days, and so I think there's a legacy of those great virtues of the Christian faith that is lived out really clearly in those lives.
I've been trying to let one word surface from your question, and the only one that keeps coming back around for legacy is the word faithfulness. I think the commitment of all of the women to stay engaged, to stay in missions, to continue to participate in some way in faithful service to the Lord, whether it was there in South America or coming back to the States. The steadiness of the families. We've, of course, enjoyed Steve's work through the years and his continued efforts to both keep the story alive, but more importantly, to continue to serve the Wadani people. And I see that as probably the legacy that I would say, driven by love and driven by what the love of Christ that people experienced personally and wanted to then take and share with the world. And then the faithfulness to continue on through hardship and loss and tragedy.
Jim and Andrea Hawthorne. Well, it's time to move on to hear more about humble things, this time making a home. Do we think that missionary activity is only far away? Elizabeth thought that a job that had been given her to do was a privilege, a gift, an offering that she would be able to give to God. God looks for faithfulness, she thought. She added, there is nothing worth living for unless it is worth dying for.
I may be talking to some today who wish with all their hearts that they could make a home, and you really feel that you have no possibility of that. Maybe you live in one room. Maybe you don't even live in one room that you can call your own. Maybe you have to share a room with someone. But I'm convinced that deep down in the heart of every one of us women, there is that ancient nest-making instinct. The desire and even the gift of making a cozy and comfortable place in the most unlikely situations. I'm talking to you today as a woman who has lived in a good many very different kinds of places. I spent 11 years as a missionary in South America, and in those 11 years, I counted up, I think, 14 different houses that I lived in, houses ranging from a very civilized place in the city of Quito, where I studied Spanish, a house belonging to a cultured Ecuadorian couple, everything from that down to a house in Auca territory, a house with no walls and no floors and no furniture. But I want to tell you a little bit today about my first home in the western jungle of Ecuador. In my last talk, I told you about my journey down from the city of Quito into Santo Domingo in the western jungle between the Andes and the Pacific Ocean. My friend Dorothy and I had been transported from Quito down into the jungle on the back tailgate of a pickup truck belonging to a missionary whom I'll call E.T. He and his wife occupied the front seats, and the back of the truck was filled with cargo, and we sat on the tailgate. I think it was about a 10-hour journey. You can imagine that by the time we got to where we were going, our derrieres were slightly sore. We got there after dark, and E.T. began unloading the cargo. I had to say that my curiosity was stretched to the limit over all this stuff that was in the back of the truck. I really could not imagine what he was carrying down there. It seemed far more than he and his family could use. Well, it was. What I was not used to at that point was that when missionaries go anywhere in a car, they are expected to transport all the people and cargo and chickens and pineapples and pigs and whatever else people would like them to carry. Well, E.T. didn't have any chickens and pigs on this trip, but he did have 100-pound sacks of flour, huge, maybe 25, 30-pound sacks of lentils and macaroni, and all of this stuff had to be carried into the house. There were 4 children who came tumbling out of the house when we arrived. As far as I could tell, none of them spoke English, although they were obviously E.T.'s children. They had that American look about them, but they spoke Spanish to each other and Spanish to their parents. Dorothy and I were shown into a room which opened into 2 other rooms, and there were no doors. In fact, the house seemed to have 4 rooms, all of which opened into each other. As for sanitary facilities, they were, shall we say, very simple indeed, very primitive. There was an outhouse at the back of the lot, a sort of a crazy, crooked affair with a door that didn't really close very securely. And then I noticed that there was an empty lot next door, which seemed to be the public outhouse. There was a continual train of people moving in and out of that lot, and as I could see, they were not really looking for privacy, they were just looking for space, judging by the care with which they were picking their way across the lot. It was very obvious that this was the town latrine. So I was very grateful for the outhouse. It's all relative, isn't it? When you find yourself with none of what we think of as the modern conveniences, then you begin to understand that all of these things are just relative and really no big deal. Dorothy and I managed to sleep fairly well that night. We were given 2 cots. And the next day, my main desire was to get out of that house. It was a chaotic place. There seemed to be all kinds of people coming and going, people buying things and selling things and coming for medicines, and the children were running in and out, and far more than the 4 children that belonged to the missionaries. And the wife of E.T. was terribly busy, and I could see that she didn't need 2 more guests. And after having tried several times unsuccessfully to offer our services, I just said to Dorothy, well, why don't we go for a walk? And so we went out and walked around the little town of Santo Domingo, but which back in those days looked like a Hollywood set for a Western. It was a primitive place. There were no paved roads. It was all pretty muddy. The shops were set in a square around a sort of plaza, and it was mud everywhere. In the middle of the plaza were the huge banana trucks. Santo Domingo depended entirely on the banana business, and probably many of the bananas that you buy today in your supermarket would come from that area of Ecuador. And I noticed that these trucks were American truck bodies, but they had added to them ungainly wooden bodies built onto the chassis and painted all colors of blue, red, pink, hot pink, yellow, green, and decorated with pictures and curlicues and mottos and names like Hitler, Mother of God, Little Angel, the Bull, or the Sacred Heart of Jesus, names denoting power. It took me a while to realize the importance of these trucks. They were the very heart and life of the jungle, and the owners of these trucks would go into terrible debt for many years in order to buy one. And so they were coddled and watched over and polished and taken good care of, although they made the grueling journey up to Quito, which was almost 10 hours in second gear, every other day or so. Well, it turned out that E.T. had a banana truck too, and I saw that he was much distracted from what we thought of as missionary work by his banana business. Well, we stayed for all of that day, one more night, and then the following day we were to reach our final destination, which was in San Miguel, a little clearing further in the jungle that we could reach only by horseback. We were able to hire ponies, what I would call ponies. The Indians called them horses, but they were very small. We were able to hire them for about 90 cents a day. I had 1 pair of saddlebags that I had brought with me from the States that I'd bought in a Army surplus store in Philadelphia. We loaded our boxes with our other things on mules, and we set off over the 4-hour trail. It was a muddy trail, the horses sinking sometimes almost to their bellies, and we were splashed almost from head to toe with mud, but it was a beautiful ride through giant ferns, tropical trees, jungle, elephant ears. Every now and then we were surprised by sweet fragrances of flowers that we were not able to see. Then I recognized the huge spreading breadfruit tree, recognized it only from pictures, and occasionally we passed travelers going the other way back to Santo Domingo, and most of them were leading donkeys that were carrying huge round balls of brown sugar, balls about almost the size of basketballs. This was the product that the jungle produced to take out to the white man's village of Santo Domingo. After 4 hours or so, we reached the clearing which was to be our destination. There were 6 or 8 wooden houses, and from one of them suddenly I saw a figure dressed in a light-colored dress come flying out the door. And this was Doreen, my colleague for that year, an Englishwoman that I had met in New York several years before. "Welcome to San Miguel on the Mud," she said. But she said it in her British accent, which I won't attempt to reproduce here. And she took us into her house, which was quite civilized, with a large room and screened windows. I remember very well the fact that she had about 6 or 8 different patterns of cretonne and cotton slip covers. She had many different colors of cretonne and slip covers and pillows and tablecloths. And I learned that the English people like as many patterns as they can get together in one room. It looked a little bit frantic to me, but as Doreen said, it's better than no color at all. She had a bedroom partitioned off with a real bed with springs, and I thought, well, things really are more civilized than I expected. And she had a stack of covered boxes which served as a dresser. Then she had a little kitchen with some gasoline pressure stoves and a sort of a sandbox in which a fire was built, and a clothesline which ran from her back door to a pulley attached to a tree so that she could hang up her clothes without going downstairs. Many different little ingenious conveniences that gave me hope that things need not be quite so primitive as I had imagined. I remember very well the menu that she served us that day. We had lunch. We sat down to a table covered with a green and orange plaid tablecloth. I remember that we had spinach soup, rice, fried eggs, and tea. And most vividly, I remember a little pitcher containing the cooled boiled milk for our tea, which was covered with a scalloped crocheted doily, weighted around the edges with glass beads. I've since learned that this is very typically English. Well, so this was going to be the area in which we lived. I will describe our house a little bit later in another talk. But I thought of the words of George MacDonald, "No place on earth henceforth shall I count strange, for every place belongeth to my Christ." Are you feeling a little strange in the place where you are today? Remember that every experience, if offered to Jesus, can be your gateway to joy.
That's part 2 of Humble Things, an 8-part series, Making a Home. Sandy's one of your fellow listeners, and she looks at Elizabeth Elliot as a spiritual mentor. She talks about the time she met Elizabeth Elliot face-to-face in an unexpected place, and about the importance of not wasting widowhood.
I'm from the Washington, D.C. area. I've listened to Elizabeth Elliot on the radio program since the first day all the way to the last. I even have still the hard copies of all her newsletters. I literally have every one of her books, and they're all highlighted and written in. I definitely feel like she was my spiritual mentor. I tell that to everyone. I'm a bookstore manager now, a Christian bookstore manager, and I always recommend Elizabeth's books. She actually came to the D.C. area one year. I don't recall what year it was, but she came to the Vienna, Virginia area, which was about 15 minutes from my house, and I went to her speech, which was fabulous. But before the speech, I went to the church restroom. No one else was there, but in came Elizabeth Elliot. I gasped, and it was like I was Hollywood starstruck. I think I probably rushed up on her and just said, "I love you, I love you, I love you. You and Jesus have changed my life so much." In heaven, she will have to tell me what I said, because I literally don't remember. And I probably sounded like an absolute fool. She probably got a big chuckle afterwards. Maybe that happened for other people too. I never realized she was so tall, period, but she was so beautiful. I still miss going to the radio every day to hear her. But I do have her books, and I do cycle through them and love everything she has written to help us stand firm in our faith as mothers, as wives, and just as Christian women. Stand firm for the faith that yes, we will have trials. And by the way, I lost my husband at 50 years old, and I had all of Elizabeth's books to fall back on. I didn't want to waste my widowhood, as she had said. So I ended up taking a training course through griefshare.org and have become a grief counselor to others, not just widows and widowers, but others. And I feel like That's because Elizabeth Elliot encouraged me not to waste my widowhood. God has blessed, and I've been doing that since 2018. God bless Elizabeth Elliot. Can't wait to meet you in heaven.
Thank you, Sandy, a listener to our podcast. Maybe you'd like to add your voice as well. You can do so when you go to elizabethelliot.org. Check out the podcast section, and you can leave an audio note for us, elizabethelliot.org. More talks, devotionals, videos, and more, elizabethelliot.org. Until next time, may God remind you each day, you are loved with an everlasting love, and underneath are those everlasting arms.